Boker Tov in Boulder, Colorado. Greetings in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'm proud to say Erev Tov in Bahrain and Abu Dhabi. And throughout the Middle East, to all the friends of Israel, welcome to our webinar series here today. I am thrilled to be sharing this platform today with the IDF in our continuing series. This is the second in our series. My name is Wayne Firestone. I'm the Executive Director of the America-Israel Friendship League. I know that we have people calling in from around the world. This is an exciting time, a lot of developments, and we're going to jump into it in a moment. I'd love to just give people the opportunity to tell us where they're calling from. If you're calling in and checking the stream live from Facebook, please just consider also sharing this with your friends by hosting a watch party. If you're listening live on the Zoom platform, you can send us a quick message with a chat with where you're calling from, sending your greetings and your well wishes, hopefully for the new year and the new possibilities for the new year. We are bringing you our webinar series twice a week now. We are continuing. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, who I had the privilege of spending some time with in February in Israel when he was meeting with one of our American-Israel Friendship League delegations. Jonathan, we're grateful to have you as a spokesperson. We know you're the head of the international media branch of the Israel Defense Forces Spokespersons Unit, which means basically you have a lot to explain to a lot of people all around the world. And so we're grateful to have that opportunity to have you answer some questions today and share about many developments that are going on in the region. You work with traditional media, so you answer the hard questions from media pundits from throughout the world, and some of whom are sitting in Jerusalem, one of the largest number per capita, I think, in the world of foreign journalists. So I know you have to answer questions from them, but you also are dealing with social media and have people coming in from school children and from audiences, frankly, that could be anywhere at a computer around the world. I see from your background that you made Aliyah to Israel when you were 13 years old, and that you have been involved in various capacities in the IDF for over 20 years, including combat roles in Lebanon and Gaza as a Platoon and Company Commander, while the focus has been on the majority of your military service on international relations and military diplomacy. For 3 years, I see you were a liaison at the United Nations and the United Nations forces. So you really have an understanding of the whole world and the whole, in addition to the region. So we're thrilled to have you here with us today. A lot of people are celebrating the news of yesterday. I'm sure you had a busy day. But we also know that not everybody celebrated, or the form that they chose to celebrate was to send presents to Israel in another form from Gaza yesterday. So maybe you could start there and just tell us, just in the last 24 hours, indeed, what the response has been and what you're seeing.
Thank you very much, Wayne. I hope you can hear me clearly, and I hope everybody around the world, mostly in the US, can hear me. I will try to speak as slowly as possible. We've done a few Zoom conversations, and I know that sometimes the gods of Wi-Fi and internet are kind and favorable. Sometimes they're a bit tricky. Don't worry if the line cuts. I'll get right back up again. But anyhow, let's hope for a smooth and an interesting talk. I'd like to begin by thanking the America-Israel Friendship League for the opportunity to be here. I know that you have a very successful and engaging Zoom tradition going on, and perhaps unlike other organizations, suffering less from Zoom fatigue than others are during these challenging times. Second thing I'd like to say is to wish everybody here a Shana Tova, and really hope that the next year, Tafshin Pei Aleph, will be a better, easier, smoother, and most importantly, healthier year for everybody. We're in countries that are dealing with really challenging situations, and as I'm speaking, the day after tomorrow, Israel will go into an official lockdown, a blanket lockdown for almost all of the population. So that's for the second time, and that of course has consequences, and I'll be able to speak a little bit about how the IDF is contributing to the Israeli efforts against COVID-19. But I'd like really to wish everybody, before I begin, a really Shana Tova. And before I assume my role as a spokesperson, I'd say that over my many years I've been in military service now for 23 years. And even as a young soldier, platoon commander and company commander, it was always comforting to know that across the sea, far, far away, thousands of miles, there are people who are important and who are engaged, care about Israel, care about the IDF, care about our well-being and success. That's a very strong bond that we must maintain and keep and nurture. And meetings like this one, even though it's virtual, are of course very important for us to be able to tell you what's going on in our part of the world, so that you're informed and can engage yourselves in any ways that you see fit. So without further ado, if it's okay with everybody, I'd like to speak for around 20 minutes and then leave the rest of the time for Q&A. I will give a general military strategic overview, and I emphasize military strategic. I've done many Zoom conversations and many conferences, etc., and many times I get asked questions that are really, I understand that they're very interesting for the person who asked the question, and they're also very relevant. But I'll begin to say that since we are on Facebook and this is an open forum, I will give straight on the record answers only, since it's open to everybody. And I'll only be able to speak about topics that are within the realm of responsibility of the IDF. I will do my best not to leave you empty-handed with short answers or evasive answers, and I will try to do my best to give you the most fullest of answers I can give. But my focus will be military and things that the IDF is responsible for. So, having said that, let's get on to the actual topics at hand. Last night, early evening hours, around 8 p.m., a few minutes after that, rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip towards southern Israel. 2 rockets towards Ashkelon and Ashdod, rather big Israeli cities. Fortunately, one of the rockets missed their target, and another one was intercepted by the Iron Dome air defense system. No Israeli casualties. As the evening unfolded, Hamas and other terrorist organizations fired rockets again, and by early morning hours, after the IDF had retaliated once, terrorists had fired another salvo of rockets. We counted 12 rockets fired from Gaza towards Israeli centers of population. And of course, the aim that we understand of this indiscriminate fire against our civilians was to grab away the headlines from the very positive event that was going on almost simultaneously in Washington, D.C. Of course, an unfortunate, very negative development. I'm happy. The only thing that we can be happy about is that there were no Israeli casualties. The IDF responded against military targets in Gaza, and this time we notched up the quality of targets that we attacked and hit a few more sensitive targets belonging to to Hamas, all of them military targets, of course, and again, as always, taking great precaution not to, whenever possible, not to strike any non-combatants. By early morning hours, after we had fired, and after the other rockets were fired towards Israel, calm, a tense and fragile calm was restored, and it has been like that until now. Now, as we speak, that situation may change, and Hamas or other terrorists in Gaza might try to fire rockets towards Israel again, and then we will go into the routine that unfortunately has become a sad reality for so many Israelis living in southern Israel, of rockets being fired at them, where Israelis have to run for shelter. IDF does its best to intercept rockets, and we are very fortunate to have our Iron Dome system, which, for those of you who aren't aware, was a joint Israeli-American development project that was developed by the best companies in Israel, in the US, and to date, even to date, it is the only combat-proven intercepting system that exists in the world, capable of intercepting rockets and mortars and missiles in mid-flight. There's a few other companies around the world who have tried to develop similar systems. None of them are combat-proven. We are very happy that we have the Iron Dome. The biggest thing that it allows us, other than, of course, saving lives, is more time to breathe and more ability to make calm decisions without having the pressure of dead Israeli civilians, which, of course, would force us to be much more forceful in our response. So Iron Dome continues to operate and perform very well. The success rate is about 90%. And had it not been for that, I don't even want to think what kind of scenario we would have been in. Just a simple event like yesterday, a few rockets fired towards Israel could have ended with casualties. Those casualties would not have been, we wouldn't have been able to leave that without any response. And then we could have found ourselves in a cycle of escalation, which would have been used, of course, by the terrorist organizations to promote their political purposes. So I'm happy that yesterday ended as it did, but that does not mean, unfortunately, that tonight is going to be a quiet one, that the combat soldiers guarding the 40 miles along the Gaza Strip will be able to let down their guard. That won't happen. And it won't mean that the Iron Dome systems and the soldiers who operate them will be able to take a break, because they won't. We know that terrorist organizations in Gaza are eager to disrupt, eager to kill Israeli civilians, and it's our job to make it either impossible or as difficult as possible for them to do so. However, even though this was, in the news and fresh in memory, our biggest military threats actually don't lie in the south. They lie to our north and to our northeast. And these are the threats that are related to Iran. If we do a list of the different threats, military threats that we face, nuclear Iran is definitely on top of that list. It is a strategic, long-term, fundamental threat that the State of Israel identified long ago and has been dealing with through various means: diplomatic, economic, military, kinetic and non-kinetic, using various means at our disposal. And since this is an open call, I won't be able to go into further detail as to the different means at our disposal and the actions that we have taken. And as such, I'll focus on threat number 2 and threat number 3. Threat number 2, in terms of a viable existing threat against the safety of Israeli civilians today, as I speak, is the deployment of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the fact that today this Levantine militia, to use European colonial words, but this Levantine militia in Lebanon, which is funded by Iran and has been holding the Lebanese state hostage for quite a few years, this militia has more firepower today than many European countries have. And think about that, in a span of, if you put it in a span of 100 years, if you ever would be able to imagine 100 years ago that a small Shiite Levantine militia would have more firepower than any European country, totally unimaginable even 50 years ago, but that is the sad reality we live with today. The numbers are quite staggering. Hezbollah today has 130,000 rockets inside Lebanon, all of those rockets of various ranges, including rockets that are capable of striking Eilat. Rockets, unfortunately, that are capable of striking Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and all of the most densely populated areas in Israel. That is and remains the most viable military threat that the State of Israel faces today along our borders. It is a threat that we are concerned with. It is a threat that we think in the IDF, and I would say in Israel as a whole, that the world, the international community, is not cautioned about enough, and that there's not enough international attention on the powder keg called Hezbollah and the fact that they are in Lebanon, hiding their rockets behind civilians, under civilians, using Lebanese civilian homes, schools, hospitals, and mosques as their staging grounds, and all of those rockets being aimed at Israel. Now, as long as quiet and stability continues, and again, we're talking about 14 years since the Second Lebanon War in 2006. We've enjoyed 14 years of quiet and stability, which is great. It's excellent, and that's exactly what we want to keep. We want northern Israel to flourish. We want young Israelis to grow up and never hear the sound of a siren, and never even to think about having to run to the nearest shelter. And that is the reality today in most parts of northern Israel, and that's a great thing. We want to keep it that way. We want the economy to flourish. We want tourism to flourish. We want culture and agriculture to go ahead. And there's great resourceful people living in northern Israel. It's a beautiful part of Israel. I served there for about half of my military service, first as a combat soldier inside Lebanon, and then as a commander along the border and as a liaison officer. So I love northern Israel. I used to live there as well. And it's really a beautiful part of Israel. We want stability to be preserved. However, stability is only a very thin layer if we have an Iran-controlled and Iran-funded terrorist organization at our doorstep with more than 100,000 rockets in their possession. And the decision-making, as we know, isn't controlled by the Lebanese people, and it isn't controlled by the Lebanese government. It is controlled from Iran. Why is that an issue? Because Iran doesn't care about civilian casualties in Lebanon, and they definitely don't care, and rather they would like to have civilian casualties in Israel. So when they order Hezbollah to do one thing or another, they don't pay the price for civilian casualties in Lebanon or civilian casualties or casualties in Israel. And that's an inherent problem that's really at the center of what's wrong with the fact that Hezbollah has been able to take control of Lebanon, has 130,000 rockets, all of them hidden behind Lebanese civilians, and the rockets are aimed at us. Hopefully, we'll be able to continue to deter Hezbollah. We'll be able to continue to keep them at bay. We will continue to strike in all of the efforts that Hezbollah is doing, together with the Iranian Quds Force, in accumulating weapons, in developing new and more advanced weaponry, missiles that they are trying to develop these days, missiles that will be capable of hitting exact pinpoint locations inside Israel. We see that as a strategic threat, and we have said it very clearly from the Prime Minister to the Chief of Staff and downwards. That is something that the IDF has no intention of allowing to become a reality. Whatever we will have to do in the way in order to stop Hezbollah from obtaining those capabilities, we will. And there's a lot that goes on beneath the surface and in different dimensions, which I won't be able to elaborate about, but I can assure you that that is an ongoing situation that is happening as we speak. Challenge number 3, if we move a little bit more to the northeast, it relates to Syria. Now, Syria in itself, if we go back a few years, when the war in Syria started, and please note my words, I do not say civil war in Syria. It may have started as an internal issue, an internal civil conflict in Syria. It is no longer such. It is an international conflict where there are many fingers in the pie, many rogue actors and many terrorists and many terrorist states and many sponsors of terrorism that are involved in it. And the bottom line is that in 2011, we still had the Syrian armed forces as a viable threat against Israel because of their ability to maneuver and to challenge the IDF. That threat has decreased significantly because of the fighting in Syria, but what has increased almost on the same level is the fact that Iran has been actively using Syria to entrench itself militarily on our borders, using Syria as its staging ground. Why is that a threat? If you think of it, and if you have a map in front of you, I'm not going to pull up a map here because I don't know how good the internet speed is, and sometimes that causes trouble. But trust my words, Iran is over here, Israel is over here. The distance is about 600 miles, about 1,000 kilometers between where Iran is and has most of its firepower and where we are. And what Iran is trying to do by entrenching themselves militarily in Syria is to bridge that gap and to forwardly deploy their offensive capabilities in a location from which they can threaten Israel. We identified that threat a few years ago, 2013, 2014, and since then have been in an ongoing, has been in an ongoing campaign against Iranian entrenchment in Syria. It is also a campaign where most of what's being done we won't be able to talk about, but I can say that every once in a while there are foreign reports in the international media of different convoys and different military research centers in different Iranian bases and other things that are related to Iranian offensive meddling in Syria. Those things get blown up. And what I can say is that the State of Israel, again, the Prime Minister, the Chief of Staff, and anybody, Minister of Defense, have said very clearly that that is something that we will not allow. We will not allow a second Iranian tumor along our borders. We already have Hezbollah, which shouldn't be there in the beginning, and there is no leniency, and there won't be any leniency of having an Iranian front on our border in Syria as well. And as long as Iran continues to try to entrench themselves, they will meet a very focused, resolute defending force in the shape of the IDF and the entire Israeli defense establishment. And just for the sake of keeping the record straight, Iran, you know, I was interviewed a few days after Qasem Soleimani was eliminated. And of course, the entire world and Western media were on about, oh, what a reckless step and how dangerous it is and instability in the region. And from our perspective, the Israeli perspective, it was an act that promotes stability like very few other acts have done in the past. And the fact that Qasem Soleimani is no longer is a great stabilizing act, and it has outstanding importance for the State of Israel, for our security, but much broader than that, for regional stability, for the stability of the Middle East. So I was asked on a TV interview if we, Israel, aren't concerned about if there will be Iranian attempts to attack Israel. And I said, well, there's always room for concern because the Iranians are a shrewd and a serious enemy that we should never take lightly. But on the other hand, they have already tried to attack Israel 6 times. Since February 2018, Iran has tried to attack Iranian forces, not militia, not Hezbollah, and not any other of their proxies that they're so fond of using when they fight against others. But they have tried to attack Israel 6 times with Iranian forces. All of those 6 attacks have been tried to attack us. We retaliated in kind and made sure that there would be a significant material and human cost for any acts of aggression against us. And we also said very clearly that we hold the Syrian regime responsible for harboring Iranian aggression against us. I think that ties in to the developments that Wayne spoke about yesterday. Now, I mean, what happened yesterday and recent political changes in the Middle East. Because in the Middle East, and here I'm speculating a bit, but I'll allow myself that, the language of consistency, the language of efficiency, and of the ability to match words with deeds is very important. And in this case, we are very clear on that. Our deeds match our words. And when we say that we're not going to allow Iran to entrench itself in Syria, and we're not going to tolerate them shipping advanced weapons to Hezbollah or firing towards Israel, we also acted accordingly. And I think those messages resonate not only with the Iranians, the Quds Force, but also with other entities in the region and in the world. Last, before we go on to questions, I'll say a few words about the situation in Judea and Samaria and our overall security situation. As always, you can pick any day for the last, I'd say, 50, 60 years. If you ask an Israeli official, how's the situation? Usually we will say it's complex and it is volatile, which unfortunately is true today as well. The situation is complex, it is volatile. What we are doing in the IDF is trying to stabilize the situation as much as possible, continuing to defend Israeli assets, Israeli civilians, continue to achieve Israeli strategic objectives, whether it is around our borders or inside Israel. And we try to do so while minimizing the friction between us, the IDF, and any Palestinian civilians, and attacking only what needs to be attacked and not what doesn't. That is, of course, easier said than done, and every once in a while there is friction between the IDF and Palestinians, but we do our utmost to try to attack the infrastructure of different terrorist organizations, namely Hamas, who are trying to establish themselves in Judea and Samaria as well, and we operate constantly against them, while on the other hand, balancing the civilian situation in the best, the civilian population in the best possible situation. So, of course, it's a very brief summary at 15, 20, 30,000 feet of the different challenges that we have. But I think it's enough for you to be able to ask whatever questions that you think are relevant, and I will do my best to try to answer. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Okay, so let's descend from 20,000 feet to about, I don't know, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 feet. We have questions coming in specifically about Gaza. And a question actually from a retired American Air Force officer who is asking about ceasefires with Hamas. And specifically to explain why would Israel agree to a ceasefire with Hamas, knowing that the likelihood is that that they will not actually adhere to the ceasefire. Can you explain a little bit how that works in terms of deterrence and what the rules of the game are?
So without going into the political domain and whatever is done at the Prime Minister's level and the Minister of Defense's level, I can give you the IDF perspective. It's a bit of a pessimistic one, and I'll explain why. The way we look at the Gaza Strip and the organization that governs it, the terrorist organization known as Hamas, we understand that as long as Hamas is in power, as long as Hamas governs that area, then the ability to move beyond military conflict and to go into other realms of conflict resolution is very limited, simply because we're dealing with a jihadi extremist organization that has, number one on its charter, is to obliterate the state of Israel by any means, and what they have written on their flags is mukawama, resistance. They see themselves as a resistance organization. That is their aim, and that is what they focus most of their resources on. Not on the welfare of the civilians that they're responsible for, not on building a future for themselves, but on trying to militarily overcome Israel, which, in my point of view, at this stage is an exercise in futility, and it only brings suffering to Palestinians in Gaza. But having that situation, understanding that Hamas unfortunately governs the Gaza Strip as they have been for the last 13 years, then the area where we have leeway to operate is actually between its different ceasefires and the aspiration for stability. Now, the last major confrontation was in the summer of 2014, where there were quite a lot of casualties, unfortunately, in Israel, a lot of casualties for Hamas, unfortunately also civilians in in Gaza. And at the end of the day, that led to probably a few years of stability. Last year was rather unstable, but at the end of the day, we understand that the realm of possibilities is only in the realm of ceasefires from a military perspective. So what we try to achieve, the IDF, is to enhance our defenses and take away from Hamas all of the offensive military capabilities that they used to have. And I'll explain. If you go back to the late 1990s and early 2000s, Hamas were world leaders in the export or the production of suicide bombers. They had an industry of suicide belts, suicide bombers being sent towards centers of Israeli population, and suicide bombers blowing themselves up in Israeli cities, killing dozens of Israeli civilians every month. That stopped not because Hamas changed their strategy and because they became humane and conformed to the law of armed conflict. No, they are still a ruthless terrorist organization. What stopped was that we maneuvered into the centers of Palestinian population and started attacking the network and the infrastructure of Hamas, and we made them flee and run for their own safety instead of having the time to attack Israel. And another thing we did was to build an obstacle on the ground separating between Palestinian cities and Israeli cities and making it much more difficult for a suicide bomber with the belt to go from a Palestinian city and blow himself up in an Israeli city. That's, by the way, the very infamous or internationally unpopular so-called wall of separation, which we call the security fence. And even it may not be pretty, but I can tell you as an Israeli civilian and an Israeli officer, that obstacle saves lives. And had it not been for that fence defending Israeli civilians, we would have had suicide bombers blowing themselves up on Israeli civilians, which would have triggered other military responses. So we took away that capability. I spoke about Iron Dome before. That has effectively negated the ability of Hamas to really inflict casualties, mass casualties in Israel. And thanks to Iron Dome, we've taken that ability. And the third ability that Hamas used to have were attack tunnels, terror tunnels coming under the border into Israel. Now, since October 2017, we have exposed and destroyed 21 terror tunnels that were dug from Gaza into Israel. How? By using a new and unique technology that so far only we have, that is capable of scanning the ground and using various sources of information, finding a tunnel, no matter how deep it is, and then using the adequate munitions to target it. By the way, if you're a former service member of the U.S. Armed Forces, then we're also, of course, sharing it with the U.S. This was also a joint Israeli-U.S. development. So Hamas is left with what they have. And again, coming back to your question, our job is to promote stability, be prepared for war, have the capabilities to conduct war successfully at the orders of the Israeli government and cabinet, and for as long as it's possible to maintain stability for the benefit of the local Israeli population. It's an ugly situation, and I mean, I'm happy that no other Western country has to deal with what we deal with, but when you think of it, it's like having ISIS at our doorstep. They're not that very different from ISIS, Hamas, in their outlook. They're a little bit less media savvy, and they're a little bit less compelling when it comes to gruesome executions, but they're not far from it.
Jonathan, staying on the issue of Iron Dome, there's a question from Stephen about the financial cost of continuing to need to respond to various provocations from the missiles. It's expensive, right? And so, is there a risk here, of a war of attrition, given that there are multiple fronts that they can send up their cheap rockets, and Iron Dome has to knock it down with something very expensive? Are there less? Is the price going to come down? And are there alternatives to that? How do you view that?
That is true. The price is high, but it is a price that the state of Israel, the IDF, is willing to pay in order to defend Israeli civilians. That's the bottom line. Do we have I'll say about the amount of interceptors. They're called Tamir interceptors. We have a lot of them. Would we like to have more? Definitely. Do we continue to produce them? Also definitely. And do we also, while as we speak, try to develop new technologies that are more cost efficient in order to intercept rockets and missiles and mortars and whatever? That is also going on as we speak. But as of now, that is the best tool that we have. It is very effective, as I said. And yeah, from an economic point of view, it's not great, but I can assure you that we are not anywhere near some breaking point or something like that in terms of economy. We have enough of the interceptors, and really the one thing that has developed really exponentially, to use a popular word from COVID-19 research, one thing that has developed very well is our ability to calculate, the radar's ability and the computer's ability to calculate the exact point of impact of a rocket. In the past, we had to fire and intercept more rockets. Today, we have a much better ability to understand where a rocket is going to land, and if it will land in an open area, we have a much more leeway in terms of deciding whether to intercept or not. I'm not going to say what we do if we intercept or not, but I can say that we have a much better ability, and that factors in the equation of the amount of interceptors available and what kind of continuity we have and how we're prepared to continue to operate. But as we speak, our defense industry, which is a really impressive defense industry, is working on it, on perfecting algorithms, on producing cheaper interceptors, lowering the price, economy of scale and all that, and also looking at other solutions. As far as I know, Iron Dome is what we have. We're very happy with the system. It has saved countless Israeli lives, and it's doing a great job.
Jonathan, there's a question pulling out for a minute now to general sort of strategic Israel's really qualitative military advantage in the region. It was reported that Israel, by one of our viewers, that Israel has agreed to the supply of advanced subs to Egypt by Germany, and as part of the discussions yesterday around the Abraham Accord, there were reports that the UAE will also get advanced warplanes. So the question is, as these incrementally are happening in the region, is there a concern that Israel could lose its qualitative military edge?
Well, this really brings into, here I'll bring into, I'll remind everybody that there's lots of politics in that question. What I can say is I will just echo the statement of the Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz, member of Knesset Benny Gantz, who said that Israel will maintain its qualitative military edge. That is something, of course, that is very important for the IDF and for the state of Israel. And at this stage, I won't be able to elaborate more as to exactly what, who gets what, and whatever deals are happening. It's beyond me. I can say one other thing, though, which relates to, but isn't specifically related to that topic. Hardware is one thing, but the ability to operate the hardware, the training and the quality of the personnel, many times that's overlooked. And for those of you who are more senior than I am and who lived through the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War, and even the Independence War, you'll remember that most of those wars we were outnumbered, and the quality of our hardware was inferior to that of our enemies. And Russian or Soviet fighter jets and many other things that were flying around us, and we found solutions and were able to overcome those as well. I say that as context, not as a political statement and not as anything, but I say that I have great confidence in the personnel of the IDF, on our ability to train and to maximize the amazing hardware that we have, some of it we buy, a lot of it we develop ourselves, and our ability to leverage it and to combine it with first-grade personnel, I think that's a key that many times in the very shallow media coverage of a topic is overlooked. On the battlefield, I can assure you that that is absolutely crucial.
We have a question from Stephen about the potential for defense cooperation in the region with Gulf allies following the Abraham Accord. Is there anything you can say or any speculation you can give about what we may, what may be a possibility that wasn't a possibility previously?
There are many things, I'm happy to say. There are many venues, many options, many ideas that are being considered and explored. I won't be able to, unfortunately, elaborate about the different ones. I'll give a few indications. As I said before, whenever we are attacked by anybody, then the entire Middle East watches. And many Sunni Arab countries have seen how the malign behavior and influence of Iran in the region. Some of those countries have also felt that malign bullying of Iran, whether it is in the Persian or Arab Gulf, whether it is in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, of course in Lebanon. So the fact that there's a clear vector here, and a clear type of activity of Iran is very clear to everybody. People have also seen, the same countries have also seen how we have responded. And a famous journalist once said that between Tehran and Tel Aviv, there's only soft tissue. And there's a lot of, there's more than a grain of truth to that. And I think many people in the area have seen that. Many people understand and appreciate the knowledge, expertise, know-how, and ingenuity when it comes to security. I'm not talking about Startup Nation and medical devices. I'm talking specifically about my business, military. And they see and they appreciate and they want to see how they can benefit from that. So we already have excellent, very important strategic communication and cooperation and coordination with our closest neighbors, with Egypt and Jordan, which has been going on for many years. That is something which is excellent for the security of the three countries. It's excellent for regional stability, and it's something that we are all vested in, and it's a great thing. And I think that also is kind of a role model for what maybe other countries are looking for to obtain from Israel. And we, of course, have our list of interests and requirements that we are going to pursue, all of them related to our security and negating Iranian malign activity in the region.
Yeah, I see that one of our viewers, our loyal viewers who calls in from Kuwait is also asking about, which countries and what potential for regional cooperation, and whether you're optimistic that's going to happen.
Well, I'm definitely optimistic about the future. I'm optimistic about our ability to continue to defend ourselves, and I'm optimistic about our resolve to stand up to Iranian aggression. Enemy, they are very committed. They are unfortunately with lots of resources and lots of money that they focus on their malign activity in the region. The Iranians themselves, a year and a half ago, an Iranian legislator said that Iran has spent between 20 and 30 billion dollars, the equivalent of 20 to 30 billion dollars in Syria, and for the purposes, of course, of expanding their influence and entrenching themselves militarily. But I'm optimistic about our capabilities, about the Israeli economy, about Israeli defense, about the strength of the people of Israel and the state of Israel. And since we live in a rough neighborhood, I'm also optimistic that people around us see those capabilities and are perhaps drawn to it. It doesn't, of course, mean that it's going to be a peaceful time ahead Hezbollah is on our doorsteps. The Iranians are trafficking in Syria with lots of sensitive and advanced weaponry, and many things could go wrong. But bottom line, as said also by our Chief of Staff and even by the Prime Minister, there are many things to be happy and optimistic about. And last week's developments are, of course, anything that brings about stability and peace is, of course, a very positive and optimistic thing.
So one more regional. You said you stated the obvious, that you live in a tough neighborhood, and maybe our Jonathan could put up the Google map again just to show the full spectrum of threats that you've been addressing. But we had a question about Turkey, and if you could explain the current and hoped for military strategic relationship with Turkey. Where do the Kurds fit into this equation these days? A specific question: is there a risk that Turkey will pose a new regional threat with the new oil shelf explorations in the Middle East?
Yeah, so that's a good question, really a big picture one, and I can say that a year and a half ago was the first time that our yearly intelligence assessment in the IDF actually named Turkey, or more rather actions made by Turkey under the current leadership, as something that is of a concern for and I think that many countries or people around the world are looking closely at decision making in Turkey. Turkey is not an enemy. We of course used to have good economic and military relations with Turkey. Unfortunately, some of those have taken a turn for the worse over the last few years. And currently we are watching, assessing, understanding, and assessing and analyzing what's going on the other side. And I'd say that there are, I think, before Israel is concerned about what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean and actions of Turkey, I think that there are many other countries who have expressed concern, and even more than that. So on this platform, that's as much as I'll say. But there are definitely developments, things that are going on that we are watching and monitoring, and hopefully things will go back to a positive vector of development. But of course, we continue to monitor whatever is happening in our region and any player or any entity and state that influences our security.
We had a question from Joseph about what technologies, if any, can be used to intercept the balloons in Gaza. And that's something we haven't seen, at least recently in the press, as much. What has been the situation with that relatively, low cost for launching and high cost, if any of those would actually land?
It's like the peak, or the most extreme example of a very crude, low-tech weapon that is elusive and very difficult to defend against, even using very advanced defense systems. I'll be frank, we have not found a 100% foolproof protection suite against these incendiary balloons that are being launched from Gaza towards Israel. We have developed, Israel has, not the IDF, Israel has developed a laser that is capable of cutting or intercepting these balloons as they fly towards Israel. And that laser has been gaining successes and has been more and more effective. But at the end of the day, we do not have a complete solution yet. We continue to work on it. But again, just to put things into perspective, we're talking about hundreds of objects, you know how big balloons are, in the middle of the sky, moving quite quickly with the power of the wind over an area that is a front area that is about 40 or 45 miles. So it's a big area to defend in our point of view. And unfortunately, the only thing that they have to do in order to make some kind of an achievement is for a 50-cent balloon to land in an open field, start a fire, and for Israeli journalists or Israeli civilians to get it on their camera, for it to be broadcast, and for Israelis to be scared of it. They've made their achievement. And that's really the flip side, or in a nutshell, the whole issue of modern warfare and what we call disproportionate forces between two sides. But I can assure you, as we have said to Israeli civilians, we continue to develop these means. We continue to constantly find new solutions. Just like for a certain period of time, we didn't have a defense system against rockets. Now we have one, and one that is extremely efficient. Balloons aren't rockets. They don't kill anybody. They've caused fires, and we don't want that to happen. But we continue to develop systems for that as well. I'll have time for one last question.
Oh, only one. Okay, so we have, how about two? A quick one on drones. We had two questions about drones and how they can be used offensive and defensively. And I just have to ask you, somebody else asked earlier, Joseph, on the IDF role in combating Corona. I know you're headed into a quarantine shortly. So just if you could hit those two on your way out.
So drones, Israel is a world leader in the deployment, the manufacturing and the deployment of what we call remotely piloted aircraft. That's how the Air Force people want us to call it, because it is remotely piloted. It's not a unmanned aerial vehicle because it's controlled from afar. I can only say that we use these platforms for various needs. It's a great tool for fighting against terrorists in dense urban areas. And the combat experience that we have today and the variety of UAVs or remotely piloted planes and similar platforms is growing. We have drones this size, and we have drones with the wingspan of dozens of meters, dozens of feet, and anything in between for various tasks and purposes. And it's something that we continue to develop, and it's also a great source of revenue for the Israeli military establishment or defense establishment. But I won't be able to go into other roles. I can just tell you that, believe me, we're using them a lot. COVID-19, very big issue here in Israel. I'm sure you all follow the news, and we see that the state of Israel, we're not doing it well. Rather on the contrary, the IDF is 100% committed to assisting in whatever the government asks us to do. We're currently focusing on building a system to cut the chain of contamination and to do what we call trace testing and finding people who contaminate, isolating them, and by doing so, cutting the chain of the contamination. Easier said than done when we're talking about a lot of numbers every day. And the IDF is contributing to other things as well, assisting the elderly, quarantine hotels, and many other things that we're doing. But at the end of the day, it is an all-hands-on-deck situation where we are really at the service of the state of Israel. Going back to your question before about being optimistic, I'm optimistic about this as well, even though it is a challenging time. I can tell you that, and from speaking, family, friends, and other civilians here, and even other service members, it is a challenging time. There's lots of unknowns and stress and tension, but I am confident that we will weather this storm as well. Wayne, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I wish all of the viewers a Shana Tova. I wish the next year to be better than this year. I wish everybody health, joy, and hope to see you soon in Israel not through the Zoom, but here in our beautiful country. Thank you very much.
Jonathan, Shana Tova, we'll leave you to your family and wish you a happy and safe new year while we close up here. Thanks again for your service, and thanks so much for this really, really informative and thoughtful briefing.
Thank you very much.
To everyone out there, we have people calling in from Tucson, Las Vegas, Portland, White Plains, St. Augustine, San Diego. Thanks for being with us. Our series, Friends and Deeds, has been built for you. Your responsiveness, your input has helped us not only build friendships during this period, but really to sort of better understand the challenges we face and, frankly, the moments that we have for celebration. For all of you that are celebrating the holidays, please make sure you don't sign on Sunday looking for another bi-weekly episode from the AIFL. We will be off the air and celebrating as well, but please do make sure that you come back on Wednesday of the 23rd, where we're going to have a special concert from the Israeli Opera. We've done this before, extremely, extremely popular, with folk songs from Israel around the high holiday themes. We want all our friends next Wednesday to join us. We won't be talking, no talking heads, we promise. We're just going to introduce this beautiful, beautiful concert for you, and there'll be subtitles. Our team has worked hard to make sure that everybody, even if you don't speak Hebrew, can enjoy the music, but also have an understanding of the heritage and the culture that the music comes from. These are beautiful songs. So for, you saw our different addresses up on the screen previously. You know where to find us. As always, we put all of the videos of our webinar series. They're all up. If you look in the events section of our website, you're able to take a look at anything you want. And every 2 weeks, we send you a sizzle reel of the highlights of the various different clips. So we're grateful. We're also, if you're grateful and you're enjoying this series, we also want to encourage you to help us make it happen. We have a generous donor who's matching all of the gifts that we get in September. So if you want to make a contribution, if that's part of your holiday spirit of supporting this nonprofit and other nonprofits at the high holiday season, please go to our website. Everything that you donate up to $1,000 is going to be matched as part of the Milch Match. So we're grateful for your comments. We're grateful for your prayers. We're grateful for any contributions you want to make to us during this period. It's indeed really an honor to have the kind of guests like Jonathan Conricus, being able to share up to the moment what's happening in the region. It's an exciting time. There are still threats and challenges, but for the coming year, we hope that all of our Israeli friends who we know are going into a new period of quarantine, we hope that all our friends around the United States and around the world will continue to be safe. Shana Tova to everyone, to you and your families. Thank you on behalf of all of our friends of Israel and all of our team at AIFL.